I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Elizabeth to tonight's CASA seminar. So she is an associate professor of geography at UNC Charlotte, which is also, I know, where she completed her PhD in 2012. Her research areas include urban and neighborhood dynamics, transportation, spatial analysis and modeling, GI science, and geocomputation. And on her bio, Elizabeth writes, I enjoy seeking out new data sources or methods and investigating their potentials and limitations in illuminating processes of change, which I think is something very much in the CASA spirit. Tonight, Elizabeth is going to be talking or walking us through 2 case studies relating to her really exciting work that combines textual and spatial analysis. So for any master's students in the audience, pay attention because there are opportunities here to do the same thing in Foundations of Spatial Data Science. And so with no further ado, thank you very much for joining us from your temporary home in the Netherlands. And over to you, Elizabeth.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I'm a big fan of CASA from afar. Actually studied abroad at the UCL when I was an undergrad, not in the geography department. I took a lot of architecture courses, so it's good tour down memory lane. All right, let me share my screen. I'm assuming you can all see a screen?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for the introduction. So today, as John mentioned, I'm going to talk about 2 case studies and also some other random ideas that I've been formulating and having some fun with, dealing with text analysis or spatial analysis of text of real estate listings right now from the internet. So the first case study is with my co-author, Isabel Nilsson. And this was a paper that we recently published in CUS. And so this is sort of our first foray into this, where we gathered some sample data, and we just wanted to see if we can learn something interesting. So I'm going to talk about this and kind of what we learned and where we're going next. But I'd like to start off with where this idea even came from, because this sort of forms our motivation. And so this is a picture I was at the moment when the idea sprung up in my mind. So we were doing a case study or looking for a case study site on a project looking at the impact of a new light rail line in Charlotte on nearby neighborhoods. And there was going to be a qualitative component to the study. And we wanted to find neighborhoods that there weren't a lot of changes already happening. That would make a good case study. We can tease out what the light rail was doing to these neighborhoods. And so as soon as the rail line opened, our research assistant and our postdoc and I and Isabel, we all just got on the train and we got off at every stop. And we were here at this stop called Sugar Creek. And we were walking around and I couldn't figure out what was happening in this neighborhood. There was a really expensive craft beer can that was crushed along my feet, but these houses didn't look very exciting. People did not seem very welcoming. The train station can't be seen from this picture. It's sort of underneath a bridge or an overpass. So I said, what is even going on here? So I did what I normally do when I'm trying to learn about a city, which is I pulled out my phone and I pulled up an app called Zillow, which in the US is our kind of real estate listing app. And I find that when I start reading these descriptions, it tells me, it gives me a sense of the place that I'm dealing with. So in this particular location, the advertisement said for the property that I was standing next to, it says for this 1-bedroom, 1-bath home, which is 755 square feet, so a really small home. And it says this is a property. This property is a builder's dream, a level double lot. So it's advertised as a lot. Within walking distance, the new Sugar Creek light rail station. The station stop is quickly becoming a major retail and entertainment hub. Debatable. The house is tenant occupied, right? So it's clear that there is a house with a tenant where they could make $600 a month. But clearly they're advertising this as something that you could probably knock it down, evict those tenants, and then build something and be quite close to this light rail, right? So they're really trying to market this to a particular person who will help transform this neighborhood. So that's where these kind of light bulbs started to go off. So, well, what else can we learn about how neighborhoods might change from how they're being advertised? Can we get a sense of this foreshadowing that, oh, this is a light rail station, it's marketed to a particular clientele, they're trying to evict this tenant. And then likewise, we were looking at light rail. So could we, if we matched this up with who's actually moving in, could we also start to better understand the relative importance of different amenities and how they're advertised, and then who's responding to those ads? So those were the big questions that we left this walk with as we scurried home to collect some data. And then we had to fit it into some theoretical framework, of course. So we started to think, well, what could we actually learn about this, right? And so thinking about processes of neighborhood change, we think of them as the result of people moving in and out, and also changes in the built environment. We can use this amenity-based framework for understanding residential sorting, thanks to our friend here, Mr. Thibault, who says that certain groups of people will outbid others for a bundle of amenities. And we also know that there's this shift underway that in the past, at least in the US cities, a lot of our sorting by income was explained by commuting times and the desire, if you're wealthy, you were living in a larger house in the outskirts of cities. But nowadays that has changed a lot. So there's an increased demand for walkability and consumption amenities. And so because of these shifts and because of these desires, different amenity preferences by groups, we don't quite have those monocentric rings or concentric rings that we had long ago. Instead, cities today are a bit more fragmented in who lives in what, who lives where, in their spatial patterns, according to what bundle of amenity they're responding to. So this is sort of our background in fitting some theory to some data-driven work. But on the other hand, of course, we know that people don't always get to live in the neighborhood of their choice. And our housing market is far from one that's an equal opportunity one. We have all of these years of discriminatory processes that have prevented certain groups from purchasing homes in the neighborhoods of their choosing. So we have, of course, histories of discrimination, and that restricts especially African Americans from buying homes in high amenity neighborhoods. But we also have this potential role of realtors in how they market properties. So in the US, at least realtors work on commission, right? So it's in their best interest to sell a home for as much as possible. And so in order to make the largest profit, they're going to market a home in a certain way. And it's also in their best interest if a neighborhood becomes more and more expensive, right? So they would like neighborhoods to flip. So this all, again, sets the scene for sort of our research questions and this research objectives, which is, what is the role that listings play in the sorting process? And does the language used vary by the racial makeup of neighborhoods and who's purchasing homes in those neighborhoods? So in this first paper, we really focus on the second question. So whether this language varies by who's purchasing homes in different neighborhoods. So in order to figure this out, as I mentioned, we scraped some data from this website Zillow, which gets all of our property listing data for our city. And then we match this up with data that's updated annually, which is publicly available in the US on Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So this is who's applying for mortgages at the neighborhood level. And it has data on the race, income, I believe that's it. Well, other characteristics, but race and income and not so much age. So race and income of who's applying for those mortgages. And so we've got these two pieces of data that are really fine or high resolution in temporal scale, which we think might be useful in understanding changes in kind of more real time than we're used to if we wait for the census data to come out. So what we did for this first paper was we first developed some typologies of neighborhoods using that HMDA data. And so that tells us it kind of gives us a sense of the neighborhood. So who's applying for mortgages in what kind of neighborhood? And I'll explain that in a second. And then once we classified the neighborhoods, we then did some exploratory text analysis, looking at the frequency of words by different neighborhood type from the property listings. And then our third step, we did a logistic regression model to look at the relative importance of words. And then we also did a little predictive exercise to see if we can predict the type of neighborhood the property is located in using the text as the data. So I should give a better background of this. So our case study is Charlotte, North Carolina, where a university is, which is located in a county called Mecklenburg. And so Charlotte is a very fast growing city. It's located in the Southeast. It was, or it still is, one of the largest banking headquarters of the country. So large knowledge-based economy. And it's been going, obviously, if it's fast growing, it's been undergoing pretty rapid changes. So we came up with this typology. We just did some K-means classification, again, using that home mortgage lending data. And I've done a lot of these types of clustering using all kinds of census data. And this is probably my favorite classification based on how well I know the city, which I've lived in for 12 or 13 years now. So I think this really captures the dynamics that are pretty current. And so what we did was we classified them using the share of applicants who were Black, white, and Hispanic in 2018, and also the change in that share. I think it was the 5-year change, so 2013 to 2018. We also included the median income of the mortgage applicants and their change in income. And then we have 2 variables that are census-based that tell us the share of minority residents, both in 2013 and then the change. So our classes are, and you don't have to commit this to memory, I will try to remind you. So we've got these different types of neighborhoods. So we have this one, which we'll just call white and higher income, which is that the mortgage applicants are largely white and of higher income. And the best way to understand this one is just to understand that they're a little bit less than this purple. So this purple is the whitest and the highest income, so median household income of close to $200,000, whereas this one is about $105,000. So everything in this blue category is just a little bit less than this, which is the most exclusive. So these are largely in the suburbs. So the city center is right here. This is the urban core. It's a bit dense just right in this area. And then the rest of the county is pretty low density, auto dominated for sure. Then we have this next class, the orange one, which is pretty interesting to us. These are largely white home buyers, but in minority neighborhoods. So you can see that in 2013, close to 80% of the residents were minority, but in 2018, almost 70% of the home buyers or mortgage applicants were white. And these are neighborhoods that we know are currently gentrifying. So this is the original light rail line and all of these orange neighborhoods here. This is was pretty undeveloped, low density land, former industrial, which is now a lot of condos and TOD. The west side was traditionally African-American, which is changing pretty quickly. So these are largely gentrifying neighborhoods. So then if white home buyers are moving there, what about our Black home buyers? And they are scattered more out into our older suburbs. So not old as in European old, but old as in 70s, 80s, 90s housing. So if these are the fancy suburbs, this is the inner city, this is this middle ring, the infamous middle ring, kind of far away from a lot of amenities. We already talked about that one. And then our last one is our smallest group. These are our Hispanic home buyers. And these kind of, you can see they kind of form a buffer between the gentrifying, oftentimes the gentrifying and the Black neighborhoods. So anyway, that's the different types of neighborhoods. So in the next stage, we're going to look at the words from the properties that have been collected from here. But first we have to collect our properties and clean it. Okay, so for this first case study, like I said, we left there from our walk along the transit line with this kind of a buzz in our mind saying, okay, we've got to collect some data, but we have no idea if this is even going to lead to anything interesting. So we just set up a web scraper and scraped 1 month of data to get started. So that got us about 8,500 property records from September of 2019. An extraordinary month, just a regular old month in Charlotte. And we just used single family homes to match our mortgage lending data. And then with these 8,500 property records, we had all of these texts with the property listings. And we spent a lot of time cleaning it. And we also learned a lot about text cleaning that we have become much better at. So when we first did it, all of this was pretty much by hand, just sort of manually. But we have now purchased a longitudinal data set from the 1990s with over 400,000 records, which we're really excited about. And we have largely automated a lot of this process thanks to, so if anyone's interested in this doing real estate thing, we found this article, and these folks have got a GitHub page where they have set up a lot of text cleaning scripts and lists, which have been really useful, and we have just added on to them. So this has been a lifesaver. So I just wanted to pass on our lifesaver to anybody else who might be interested in this work. Okay, so after we collected those records, then the next step was to do this regression analysis, or logistic regression, where we split our data into a testing and a training data set. And then we tried to predict the property type based on the text. So I'll explain that in a little bit. So that we did this for two reasons. One is it gives us a better predictive power of certain words in describing the neighborhoods, and then we get the relative importance of each word, which was what we were actually most interested in. So for instance, for prediction, once we have sort of the coefficient of each word, we could then take a listing and then predict the probability that that listing belongs to a certain neighborhood. And our thinking was eventually down the line, if we wanted to try and kind of predict how a neighborhood is changing, if there were a lot of properties being advertised for a type of neighborhood that it's currently not classified as, then we have an indication of how that neighborhood might change. Okay, but we just start off with some exploratory text analysis. So this is just for each of those 5 classes. These are the most frequent words. So the first thing we see is that there's actually a lot of similarities. So realtors are not all that creative. They tend to use the same word regardless of the type of neighborhood. But we can, if we stare at this long enough, pick out some differences. And so that's first thing is we notice that the neighborhood name, so we replace the specific neighborhood name with a generic placeholder called neighborhood name. And we find that this rises to the top in all of the classes. But what's interesting is that you can see if you look at the difference between how far ahead it is for the white higher income and the very, very white highest income compared to the next group. So we can see that it's most important in these whiter higher income, and then less of a difference between the neighborhood name and the next class in the other types of neighborhoods. So that will also come up in our next analysis. And then some other words that just sort of stick out for us. So in our white homebuyer minority neighborhood, we see words like downtown, renovated, walking. So we see walk, renovated. So these words of reinvestment, walkability kind of come up in where we've got white homebuyers, walk, renovated. Those are pretty consistent. Whereas in our minority homebuyer neighborhoods, we see more of these suburban traits. So we see car, garage, carpet, garage, car, cul-de-sac, right? So this is very much a flipping of that traditional model of whites living in the suburbs and minorities in the center cities. So just looking at the text, we can see how that has changed. Okay, so the next thing we do, so that's just exploratory. So next, these are some results of this logistic regression. So here we get the relative importance of each word in explaining that class compared to the other classes. But just one caveat, again, this was a sample data set of just 8,500 records, just seeing if we could find something interesting. So the noise in the data kind of gets amplified more so than we would expect in a much larger data set and what we have great hopes for in our newly purchased data. But with that caveat aside, we still can find some interesting things. So for instance, in the white higher income neighborhood, we see the word remodeling pop up as being more important and then negatively associated with cars. In this gentrifying neighborhood type, we see kind of these unique characteristics. So parquet flooring as being the most predictive word of being in a gentrifying neighborhood, but also words of being a qualified buyer, speaking to who might be moving in, who's welcome in that neighborhood, as well as these are hidden, the possibility. So these are things suggesting renovation or reinvestment of capital, if you will. And then words that are negatively associated, families, right? So who's not moving into these gentrifying neighborhood families, also welcoming. It's not very welcoming places. They also don't have carpeting or guests. In our increasingly Black and minority neighborhoods, stories is not about books, but stories is about two-story homes. So in Charlotte, closer to the center city, we mainly have ranch or single family homes just based on when the city was developed. And again, those are in these older suburbs where they might advertise having multiple stories. And then what's negatively associated with our Black homebuyer neighborhoods, schools don't tend to be mentioned, bungalows, and then that neighborhood name is really negatively associated, designer. In our very white and very wealthy, we have much fancier words like exquisite. Sub-Zero is a really high-end fridge. Actually, somebody bought the house next door to us and totally renovated it. And I saw the Sub-Zero fridge moving in and I said, uh-oh, I see where our neighborhood is going to. So cherry and quartzite, and what's not mentioned, of course, are vinyl and laminate. And then our Hispanic home buyer, again, this is the smallest class, but same thing where schools come up as not being mentioned, nor bungalows, custom flipping housing, they're not popular. And then again, neighborhood name is not as important. I forgot to talk about this accuracy because again, this is a small sample, but based on the small one, we can predict a property listing. It comes up with a very high accuracy, about 93%. But actually it's better at predicting what it's not in than what it's in. So we can talk more about that later. All right, so from this very, very small non-longitudinal data set, again, just seeing if this would even tell us something interesting, we extracted some interesting thing, right? These suburban indicators of neighborhoods with minority home buyer, and then these words suggesting reinvestment of capital in mainly white home buyer neighborhood. And then we see the importance of the neighborhood name in these white neighborhoods, but less so in minority neighborhoods. School also was negatively associated with minority home buyers. So what are we thinking of doing next? So as I mentioned, we bought this data set for Mecklenburg County that is now longitudinal, has a lot more opportunity for us to play with. So we spent the summer, I'm using the royal we here. We spent the summer cleaning the data. It's squeaky clean now and it's ready to roll. And, but I don't have any results for you, but I have a small teaser of some of the things we've been thinking about. So when I was doing that last thing, whenever I presented it, people were always saying, well, why don't you run some topic models and try to map those out? And every time we ran a topic model, we were super unimpressed with the results. The computer did not return anything that made sense to it. And we would stare at these topics and say, well, I guess if we could just kind of stretch our imagination, we can see something in this. But it was really dissatisfying until I came across the solution, which is what are they called these seeded topic models, where you can give some intelligence, some human intelligence. So it's a little bit more of a theory-driven topic model. So you can kind of define your topics in advance, and then you can plant some seeds, or what they call anchor words, to help it learn. So you can, for instance, just again, I did this last night and this morning, again, taking this sample data, we can define some different neighborhood processes that we want to extract. And so we might feed it the seed words for gentrification. We could feed it renovated, uptown, parquet flooring, shops, restaurants, historic, and then say, okay, here are the seeds. Now go find the other similar words related to this. And then another one, we might say, well, expensive investment. I wasn't feeling very creative, where we might have these sub-zero fridges, custom, the neighborhood name, exquisite. If we're interested in disinvestment, so people are not investing in their homes, what are going to be the next pockets of poverty, right? You might see things like carpet as opposed to hardwood floors, laminate, vinyl. And we also don't think that there'll be a lot of neighborhood amenities in areas of disinvestment. And then we've got new suburban, right? So schools and cul-de-sacs and so on. And so I just tried this out. Again, taking this sort of messy sample data set and ran this morning, and feeding it those seed words, it actually pulled out, it did a good job. So much better. I didn't put it, but I also ran an unseeded topic model. And again, it was not making much sense to me. So you can give it the 4 classes that I defined, and then as an option, it kind of can let it create its own class. So this is a residual class. So this was the computer generated one, which was ready, property, C, house, move offers. Again, computer's not that smart. But when you feed it something, so the gentrification, it picked up Noda, which is the most famous gentrified neighborhood in Charlotte. So it added that to our list. It got, that's a spelling mistake on my end, not on the computer, but island gas. So again, it starts to pick up on the other terms of expensive investment, disinvestment, and so on. And so then the last step is that each listing is then assigned a topic. And then we've got these points with all of these topics. And you can imagine our imaginations are running wild with what we can do for defining neighborhoods based on these point data sets. But you'll have to call me up next year to come back and fill you in on that. Okay, so the second thing I'm just going to briefly talk about is a second case study. This is led by my PhD student, Providence Adu. And this started when we were collecting all of that, cleaning all of the Zillow data. Again, it was by hand, and sometimes you learn a lot just by doing things the slow way. And so I was getting rid of all of the rental data. And as I was sort of reading these properties, I kept reading things like, no prior evictions. You must have this minimum credit score. You must have this. And I thought, sheesh, must be pretty discouraging to be a renter with any one of these discredited backgrounds. And I'd also just read evicted. And I was like, I wonder if we can do something with that. So I planted that seed to Providence and I said, what can you do with this? And so he did some pretty cool things. So this was a little more structured, I guess, than the last one. We were specifically looking at how extensive discriminatory or restrictive language is in rental listings, and whether it varies with the racial makeup of different housing submarkets. So what he did, actually, I think it's on another slide, but he wrote his own web scraper and he scraped 2 websites. One of them is called Craigslist. Maybe you heard of it. It's sort of like anybody can go and just sell anything they've got. So one of the categories on Craigslist is rentals. So he scraped both Craigslist and Zillow, which is a little more formal and just oriented towards housing market. So we scraped these websites, cleaned them up, and then we came up with a predefined list, again, of terms that would kind of discriminate against somebody looking for a property. And so when we're thinking about this theoretically, again, we can think that landlords are actually motivated to be discriminant in who they rent to, right? They don't want to rent to somebody who is likely to destroy their property or not pay their rent on time. And so this term of statistical discrimination is not necessarily illegal, but it encompasses anytime somebody judges an individual based on the average characteristics of their group. So low-income renters, on average, might be less likely to pay their rent on time, even though a particular individual might not. So that's the legal definition of this. And so we came up with this list of, so there are minimum income requirements, minimum credit scores, no prior criminal history, no prior evictions, and no, they do not accept housing vouchers. And so in a tighter housing market, landlords have a lot more power in selecting out which tenants can live or can rent that property. So as I mentioned, he scraped these two websites. So we ended up with about 5,000 listings. And then he analyzed them both by housing submarket, that's these right here, and then a coarser analysis just splitting the city between minority dominated or not. But first I made that fancy map for him. So once we took all of the listings, I started off with a little heat map that came up with an average score of all of the discriminatory language normalized by how many listings there were. And so this kind of highlights the areas with more discriminatory language per listing than others. And so this is the center city. So this is sort of the wealthier area, and this is a more minority area. So this is where you tend to get more restrictive language. And then just as a quick overlay, we happen to have data on recent low-income renters who had recently moved into the city. So we still need to follow up on this, but we were trying to see if they're avoiding the highly restrictive areas, if they tend to locate in areas of less restriction. So future research, we may see if this is actually significant, but for now, it made for a cool map. Okay, so for him, just gonna quickly highlight some of his findings. So again, he took this listing and he categorized, or he counted up, kind of quantified where these different restrictive languages were most common. So out of all of his whole corpus, having a minimum credit score was the most common restriction. And this is worse off generally if you're a minority resident, mainly because if you think about the financial crisis where predatory lenders kind of targeted minority residents and then ended up destroying their credit score. So this is a big deal. So this was the highest one that was most explicitly listed in the rental listings. It was about 14% of all listings. They were most common in less minority neighborhoods. And this one is an exception. This is Plaza Midwood, but as I mentioned, NODA is that most famous gentrified neighborhood in Charlotte. So this is a little bit of a fuzzy area. It's classified as minority, but it's rapidly changing and gentrifying. We also looked at homeowners associations. So these can be restrictive because they impose additional fees. So even if you can afford the rent, then you must pay this extra homeowners association fees to take advantage of the golf course, whether or not you play golf. And they also tend to have other restrictions and they've got their own rules. So this was the second most common restriction, and again, mainly in whiter neighborhoods. And then income restrictions, Section 8 housing and criminal backgrounds were the least mentioned, but they do tend to also to be largely in, well, these ones were in minority concentrated areas, so voucher and Section 8 housing, which is the most affordable housing. And evictions restrictions, so no prior evictions were most common in minority concentrated neighborhoods. And then he did one last thing, which I didn't think would return anything interesting, but it actually did. So he did some Bigram modeling, which looks at words that are most frequently appear together. And what we found out was that in mainly minority concentrated submarkets, the bigrams, the top 5 bigrams were all of these restrictive words. So first thing that comes up is this term progress residential, which is one of these corporate landlords, which have been gobbling up lots of housing, and they're notoriously for high rates of evictions and kind of crushing tenants. So we've got, progress residential, equal housing, security deposit, approved applicants, and so on. And then in the wider neighborhoods, we tend to see kind of more desirable amenities. So walking distance, a walk-in closet, minutes in Uptown, walking distance. Let's see the other one. Oops. So again, the minority neighborhoods, we tend to get that progress residential, approved applicant, security deposits. So all of these restrictive things, and the other ones, light rail, easy access, car garage, the station, and so on. So that was his contribution to all of this. So we've still got a little bit more to do, but we can see that some of this language varies by submarket, where it's a little bit more amenity focused. In the wider neighborhoods, whereas the mortgage or minority neighborhoods have more of these restrictive terms, corporate landlords, and then the minimum credit score emerges as the largest hurdle for renters entering white neighborhoods. So I think that's all we've got, actually. So that was the end of his, and that's all of our explorations into text analysis. And now I see that there are lots of things in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.